Inflation and unemployment are two closely watched statistics. Even if you never take another economics course again, you'll probably be concerned with the levels of inflation and unemployment in the future. In the long run, inflation and unemployment are unrelated problems. In the long run, inflation is caused by growth in the money supply. Unemployment in the long run occurs at the natural rate of unemployment, N star, and is dependent on the levels of structural and frictional unemployment that the economy experiences. In the short run, there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment that policymakers can exploit. If policymakers expand aggregate demand and move the economy along the short-run aggregate supply curve, they can expand output, therefore causing unemployment to decrease, but only for a while. The price level will increase, meaning inflation will occur. Policymakers can lower unemployment by causing inflation. Likewise, they can also decrease inflation, but will cause unemployment to increase. The Phillips curve is a curve that shows the trade-off between inflation and unemployment in the short run. The curve is downward sloping, representing an inverse relationship. The inflation rate is on the vertical axis, and the unemployment rate is on the horizontal axis. The Phillips curve is downward sloping. At point A, the economy is experiencing high inflation but low unemployment. At point B, the economy is experiencing low inflation but high unemployment. The Phillips curve simply shows the combinations of inflation and unemployment that arise in the short run, as shifts in the aggregate demand curve move the economy along the short-run aggregate supply curve. Let's go through an example. First, I'm going to show both the ADAS model and the Phillips curve at equilibrium. P for the price level and Y for real GDP, the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, and downward sloping aggregate demand curve. I'm not including the long-run aggregate supply curve because we are focusing on the short run. Equilibrium price level is labeled P1, and equilibrium real GDP is labeled Y1. On the Phillips curve, pi is used for the inflation rate, since capital I is used for investment and lowercase I is used for interest rates. U is used to represent the unemployment rate. If we start off at point A on both diagrams, we can see how the trade-off works. If policymakers increase aggregate demand, the AD curve shifts right. The new equilibrium price level is higher and the quantity of output is greater. Since prices have increased, inflation has increased. If the quantity of output is increasing, then firms need workers to produce that output, so unemployment falls. We've now moved to point B on both diagrams. Remember, monetary policy and fiscal policy can shift the aggregate demand curve. Therefore, the Phillips curve offers policymakers a menu of combinations of inflation and unemployment to choose from. If policymakers increase money supply, increase government spending, or decrease taxes, the aggregate demand curve will increase and move the economy to a point on the Phillips curve with lower unemployment and higher inflation. If policymakers decrease money supply, decrease government spending, or increase taxes, the aggregate demand curve will decrease and move the economy to a point on the Phillips curve with higher unemployment and lower inflation. The long-run Phillips curve is vertical because money growth does not influence the determinants of unemployment in the long run, such as the amount of structural and frictional unemployment. The long-run Phillips curve is an expression of monetary neutrality. Since money growth does not influence the determinants of unemployment in the long run Phillips curve is vertical and is another expression of monetary neutrality. Let's look at the relationship between the long-run Phillips curve and the ADAS model. Regardless of monetary policy, output and unemployment are at their natural rates in the long run. Let's look at the ADAS model and the Phillips curve at equilibrium. P for the price level and Y for real GDP, pi for inflation, and U for the unemployment rate. The aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. I'm not including the short-run aggregate supply curve since we are focusing on the long run. Equilibrium price level is labeled P1 and the natural rate of output is labeled N star. The long-run Phillips curve is vertical. Pi 1 represents the equilibrium inflation rate and N star represents the natural rate of unemployment. We start off at point A on both diagrams. If policymakers increase aggregate demand by increasing the money supply, the aggregate demand curve shifts right. The new equilibrium price level is higher, and the quantity of output stays at the natural rate. Since prices have increased, inflation has increased, and unemployment stays at the natural rate. We have now moved to point B on both diagrams. The short-run Phillips curve does not stay in one spot. Supply shocks can cause the short-run Phillips curve to shift right. This is exactly what occurred in the 1970s due to the oil shocks. Let's start with the ADAS model and the Phillips curve at equilibrium. In the 1970s, OPEC restricted the supply of oil, and the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted left, causing a higher equilibrium price level and a lower quantity of output. Remember, this is called stagflation. The short-run Phillips curve shifted right, meaning every point on the curve represented a higher level of inflation with a higher level of unemployment. Since the price level increased, inflation increased, and the economy also experienced a higher level of unemployment. In the late 1990s, the short-run Phillips curve shifted left. In 1999, unemployment was 4.2% and inflation was 1.3%, both very low and favorable levels. The United States had experienced favorable supply shocks, causing the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift right. The world price of oil and other commodities had declined. There was a favorable change in labor markets due to the baby boomer generation and huge technological advances due to the internet. Let's start with both diagrams at equilibrium. When the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted right, the price level decreased and the quantity of output measured by real GDP increased. The short-run Phillips curve shifted left, meaning every point on the curve represented a lower level of inflation and lower level of unemployment. Since the price level decreased, inflation decreased. And since real GDP increased, firms had to hire more workers, so unemployment also fell. This is the end of the Chapter 17 lecture on the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. I did not cover the